On the quietest nights in Ionia, when the air is cool enough to carry the scent of blooming night flowers across entire valleys, and when the moon reflection trembles faintly upon the slow-moving rivers, there are stories that travel from one listener to another, as though carried on the wind itself. These are not tales for children, nor the sort one shares in the crowded markets under the warmth of the midday sun. They are the sort of stories whispered after nightfall, when the tea grows cold in its cup and the lantern light sways gently in the breeze. And in these stories, there's always a name, spoken rarely and never without a trace of unease. A name that belongs to a man who calls himself an artist. Though his medium is not paint, clay, or music, his medium is life. And his final work, each and every time, is death. This is the story of Jhin, known in Ionia and beyond as the Virtuoso. His name is not accompanied by titles of military triumph, nor by the wealth of a merchant prince. Instead, his legacy is carried by the memory of meticulously arranged scenes, each of them an ending. The official records, as preserved by Riot Games and the histories of Ionia, are clear in their description. Jhin is a meticulous criminal psychopath who believes murders is art. That is not metaphor, nor a poetic exaggeration. To Jhin, the ending of a life is not merely the cessation of breath. It is a performance, an act within a greater composition. Every detail matters. The setting must be right, the sequence precise, the conclusion inevitable. And when his work is done, it is not simply that a person has died. It is that an audience, whether they know it or not, has been made to witness a moment they cannot forget. For a time, the world believed it had been rid of him. There was an era, however brief, when Jhin was a prisoner in Ionia, confined for crimes so elaborate, so cruel, that even the most patient leaders could no longer pretend he was anything but a danger. But the cell was not to be the end of his story. Hidden within the Ionian Council was a shadowed faction that saw in him something more than a killer. They saw an instrument, an artist of fear, who could unnerve their enemies far more effectively than any army's advance or any politician's bargain. Freed from his cell, armed with tools designed not merely for lethality, but for spectacle, Jhin returned to his work. Only now, his performances had the full force of intent behind them, and his reach extended farther than ever before. But his beginnings were not so grand. Jhin's earliest life lies mostly in shadow, concealed behind the thin curtain of what little Ionia records about its criminals before they are caught. It is believed that he was born in the province of Jhin, a region known for its rich traditions in both martial discipline and artistic craft. The land there is one of contrasts. Bamboo forests that sway like great green oceans, mountain ridges that cut against the sky in sharp silhouettes, and villages where artisans work in the same way their ancestors did centuries before. In such a place, precision is not simply a virtue, it is a way of life. Some accounts suggest that his father ran a martial school, one that taught styles now overshadowed by the rise of Wuju techniques. Whether or not this is true, the speculation aligns with the traits that Jhin would later exhibit: a steady hand, a disciplined posture, and an unblinking focus. But alongside these skills grew something far darker. Even as a youth, Jhin seemed drawn not only to the perfection of form, but to the unsettling beauty in its destruction. A cracked mask, shattered blade, objects broken in a way that revealed something new, something hidden beneath their original purpose. As he grew older, he found work in the theaters of Jhin. Perhaps it was the perfect environment for a young man who valued both precision and presentation. In the shifting glow of lanterns and the scent of powdered makeup, he moved scenery, adjusted curtains, prepared props. To the audience, the plays were seamless, each change of scene arriving as though by magic. But behind the curtain, Jhin was learning something deeper: the control of space, the manipulation of focus, and the art of guiding an observer's eye exactly where he wanted it to go. It was in this unseen world of preparation and illusion that his first performances took shape, not on the stage itself, but in places far removed from applause. He began to kill. His early victims were taken with blades, chosen not for convenience, but for the way their deaths could be shaped. He would leave them not where they fell, but where he felt they belonged. The surroundings arranged to complete a vision only he could see. A death for Jhin was incomplete without its scene. And in these scenes, there was no room for haste. The body had to lie at the right angle. The light had to fall in the right way. And even the smallest details, an open hand, a drop of blood, were placed with the care of an artisan applying gold leaf. As the years passed, the scenes became more elaborate. Words spread quietly at first, then faster, like a stain moving through fabric. People began to speak of a demon, golden in name, if not in form, who staged death as though it were a play. They called him the Golden Demon, and with each new appearance, the name carried more weight. Parents whispered it to children to keep them from wandering too far after dark. Travelers told the story in the hopes that it might ward off bad luck. But always, beneath the telling, there was the understanding that this was not a ghost or a folk tale. This was a man moving somewhere in the dark, choosing his next stage. Eventually, the threat could no longer be tolerated. The leaders of Sionia sent their finest to bring him down. Among them was Master Kusho, known as the Eye of Twilight, a man whose very role was to see what others could not. With him were his son, Shen, and Shen's fellow student, Zed. Together, they began a hunt that would last years, following traces of fear across cities, through mountain passes, and into the most remote villages where the scent of incense hung in the air, and the only sound at night was the slow creak of wooden shutters in the wind. The pursuit of the Golden Demon was not a single chase, but a series of quiet, deliberate steps, each one bringing the hunters closer, each one revealing a little more of the man they sought. Master Kusho understood that Jhin did not kill impulsively. He prepared, he selected, and because of that, he could be anticipated, at least in theory. But to anticipate him was not the same as catching him. For months at a time, there would be silence, no scenes, no bodies. It was as though Jhin had vanished, leaving the people to wonder if perhaps he had been nothing more than a fever dream born of collective fear. But then, without warning, a new scene would appear, a body positioned in such a way that it seemed to belong to a larger tableau, as if the moment of death had been frozen and framed for all to see. Each time, the composition was different, sometimes in the open air of a marketplace, other times in the shadowed corner of a temple courtyard. But the intention was the same. He wanted it to be found. He wanted the viewer to feel the precision of his hand. even if they could not understand the pattern. The hunters learned to study these details, to read them as one might read the brush strokes of a master painting. Where the light fell, how the victim's limbs were placed, what objects were near or far. None of it was random. But the deeper they looked, the more they realized that Jhin's was not simply killing, he was rehearsing. Each act seemed to refine the next, each scene a practice for something greater. It was not enough for him to take a life. He had to perfect the taking of it. Years passed this way. The chase wound through Ionian provinces, across narrow mountain passes, where the mist clung to the slopes and made every step treacherous, and into dense bamboo groves, where the air smelled of green leaves and damp soil. The tension of the pursuit became part of the land itself. Villagers would glance over their shoulders at night, half expecting to see a masked figure standing in the road, waiting for the moonlight to illuminate his work. Then, at last, the hunt reached its conclusion. It was in the Jhin Pass, a place of sheer rock walls and winding trails that narrowed until even two travelers could barely walk side by side. Here, Jhin had chosen his stage with the same care he chose his victims. The setting was beautiful in a way that was almost cruel. Jagged peaks in the distance, the sky fading to deep gold as the sun dipped low, and the sound of wind moving through the gaps in the stone. It was the kind of place where the world itself seemed to hold its breath. In this secluded place, Jhin had taken captives. Their presence was no accident. They were part of the scene, placed exactly where he wanted them, their positions forming lines and shapes that only he fully understood. Among them was a young boy named Yevnai, his presence adding an element of innocence to the tableau, an element that, for Jhin, was as much a part of the composition as the light or the shadows. The moment of confrontation came not with a sudden burst of chaos, but with a stillness so deep it was almost unnatural. The hunters moved with care, their eyes taking in not only Jhin himself, but the arrangement he had created. Every rock, every length of rope, every scrap of cloth seemed to have been chosen for effect. The scene was not yet finished, but it was ready to be completed at a moment's notice. And yet, it did not end in blood. Master Kusho made the decision that day that would echo through the years. Jhin was not killed. Instead, he was taken alive, bound, stripped of his tools, and watched with constant vigilance. He was led away from the mountain pass, down winding trails, and through the silent forests that stood between him and the place where he would be caged. The journey to Tula was long, and in many ways, it was the first time Jhin had been truly contained. The monastery prison was unlike the cells of ordinary criminals. Built high in the mountains, it was a place of quiet austerity, where the wind carried the scent of pine and incense through open stone corridors. Its walls were thick, but its gates were not locked with iron alone. They were guarded by discipline, by the constant presence of those who had devoted their lives to keeping the dangerous and the lost from harming the world beyond. When Jhin entered Tula, he did so without resistance. To some, it appeared that he accepted his fate. To others, it was simply another act, the beginning of a new kind of performance. The monks observed him closely. He was polite, attentive, and in some ways, an ideal inmate. He learned their crafts, poetry, metalwork, calligraphy, dance, with the same precision he had once applied to his killings. His hands were steady, whether shaping a blade or painting a stroke of ink on silk. But while his outward behavior was calm, there was no mistaking that the darkness within him remained. It did not need to be visible to be present. In Tula, time seemed to slow. Seasons passed, marked by the blooming of cherry trees in the spring and the fall of snow in the winter. The monks rose at the same hour each day, their routines unchanging, their chants echoing through the stone halls. And within this rhythm, Jhin waited. He was a man of patience after all, and patience is merely preparation stretched across time. No one could have foreseen how his time in Tula would end, not through repentance, but through the shifting of power far beyond the monastery walls. For years, the world beyond Tula seemed distant, almost unreal to Jhin. The monastery prison was a place apart from the shifting tides of politics, its walls not meant to keep people in so much as to keep the chaos of the outside world out. Yet even the most secluded peaks of Ionia could not remain untouched forever. The first signs of change came not with soldiers, but with whispers. The Noxian Empire, vast and relentless, had begun its push into Ionian lands. At first, their presence was felt on the farthest edges, small skirmishes in provinces, whose names were barely known to those in the heartlands. But the Noxians did not stop. Like a dark tide, they advanced, and with each passing season, they claimed more ground. Their methods were direct and brutal. Where Ionia sought harmony, Noxus sought dominance. The clash was not merely of armies, but of philosophies, of the very way life should be lived. From the heights of Tula, the signs of invasion were subtle at first. Fewer merchants came to the mountain passes. Travelers arrived with news of villages abandoned, of farmland burned, of warriors conscripted into defense forces they were unprepared to lead. The monks of Tula carried on with the rituals, but there was an unspoken awareness that the world they knew was changing. For Jhin, the idea of war was not shocking. It was, in a way, another kind of stage. But this stage was far larger than any he had imagined. Where his own work had been a precise, solitary performance, war was chaos on a grand scale. It had no single audience, no single composition. And yet, he understood that from chaos could come opportunity. The war reached a turning point when Noxus suffered the defeat at the hands of Ionian resistance. The combined efforts of warriors, monks, and civilians turned back the tide, forcing Noxian forces to retreat. The victory, however, was not without its cost. The battles had scarred the land, fractured communities, and left deep wounds in Ionia's sense of unity. It was in the uneasy peace that followed that new powers began to rise within Ionia. Some sought to rebuild according to old traditions, while others saw the war as proof that Ionia needed to adapt, to be willing to use whatever tools were necessary to defend itself in the future. Among these factions was one that moved in shadows, influencing events without revealing its hand. This group, whose members remain unnamed in the official records, looked beyond the battlefield for their weapons. They sought instruments that could shape perception, sow fear, and leave an impression that would outlast any military campaign. Their gaze eventually fell upon Tula, and within Tula, upon a single man. Jhin had been in the monastery for years now, long enough for the world outside to have almost forgotten his name. But to those who remembered, the Golden Demon was not just a killer, he was a symbol. His crimes had left marks not just on the bodies of his victims, but on the minds of those who heard of them. The fear he inspired was deep, lingering, and most importantly, controllable if one knew how to aim it. The decision to release him was not made lightly, nor was it made openly. Officially, there would be no record of his freedom, no public announcement that the most infamous killer in recent Ionian history had been allowed to walk the world again. Instead, he would be given new tools, ones designed not simply for killing, but for crafting fear with the precision of a master. One such tool was a custom firearm, a rare and exotic weapon in Ionia, where the bow and the blade still held dominance. This was no ordinary gun. It was designed to reflect Jhin's obsession with form and sequence, firing only 4 shots before it had to be reloaded. Each shot, in Jhin's mind, would be a movement in a symphony, each one more deliberate and perfect than the last. The terms of his release were unspoken, but clear. He was to be an agent of fear, a force unleashed not against Ionia itself, but against those who threatened its security from without, or those within who stood in the way of the shadowed faction's vision. He would be watched, yes, but only insofar as a storm can be watched. When Jhin left Tula, it was not as a man returning to freedom in the usual sense. He stepped into a world that had changed as much as he had. The roads were rougher, the villages warier, the people more suspicious of strangers. But to Jhin, all of this was raw material. Every ruined building, every scarred battlefield, every face lined with grief was a piece waiting to be placed within a greater whole. He moved through Ionia with a new purpose, but the same old obsession. Each act of violence was a composition, each death arranged to leave an indelible image in the minds of those who found it. Sometimes it was a message to enemies of Ionia. Sometimes, perhaps, it was simply a message to himself, a reminder that he was still capable of creating what he considered perfection. To those who had never seen his work, the aftermath of a Jhin performance could be difficult to understand. To those who had, it was unmistakable. The bodies were placed with impossible care, the surroundings altered in subtle ways to frame the scene, the details refined to the point where nothing could be accidental. And always, there was the lingering sense that the true audience was not the person who found the scene, but someone far away, someone watching the ripples spread outward. The world Jhin returned to after Tula was fractured. The war had ended, but its shadows remained, stretched long over villages and valleys. Ionia's beauty was still there, in the blossoms that drifted lazily on spring winds, in the hush of bamboo forests at dawn. But now it stood side by side with scars. Charred beams jutted from blackened ruins. Temple walls bore the faint, dark traces of fire. Markets bustled less, as though a layer of caution had settled over the people. For Jhin, this was fertile ground. Every scar was a reminder of mortality, every wary glance a prelude to fear. His patrons, the unseen hands that had plucked him from his cell, did not have to instruct him in his work. They simply allowed him to move, and he moved with the same precision as before. Though now, his performances had an even broader canvas. The first killing after his release was not announced, but it was felt. In a small riverside town, the locals awoke to find the central bridge adorned not with lanterns or banners, but with a scene that drew the breath from every witness. The victim lay at the midpoint, their body draped in silken cloths of red and white, positioned so that the morning light broke over them at exactly the moment the sun rose. The cloth shimmered faintly in the breeze, making the figure appear almost alive, as though they might open their eyes at any moment. But they never would. The river beneath reflected the entire image, doubling the symmetry, turning the scene into something more than death, into an installation, a statement. Jhin's work was never hurried. Each new act took days, sometimes weeks, to prepare. He studied his surroundings, as an artist studies a blank canvas, searching for the angle of light, the textures, the colors that would bring his vision into perfect balance. A grove of cherry trees might serve as the background for one composition, their petals falling in slow motion through the air, settling on pale skin like strokes of a brush. A rain-slick alley might be the stage for another, the reflections in puddles adding depth to the geometry of the scene. To the shadowed faction that employed him, the results were useful beyond their beauty. Whispers of the Golden Demon's return spread quickly. Enemies of the state, those loyal to Noxus, those resisting the new order within Ionia, or simply those who stood in the wrong place, found themselves marked not just for death, but for spectacle. Fear grew like mold in damp corners, unseen until it was too late. Jhin, of course, cared little for the political purpose. He did not kill for strategy, nor for ideology. He killed because each act was an opportunity to refine his craft. In his mind, every scene was a puzzle, each element carefully placed so that the viewer would be drawn from one detail to the next. Their gaze caught in an unbreakable rhythm until the whole image locked into place in their mind. And once it did, it could never be unseen. He traveled widely, moving like a ghost between provinces. In the fishing villages along the coast, the salty air and the cries of gulls became part of his compositions. Inland, he used the rolling fields and distant mountains as his backdrop, positioning his work so that nature itself seemed to conspire in its creation. Even the changing seasons became part of his palette. The stark contrasts of winter snow against dark pine, the muted golds of autumn leaves underfoot, the vibrant greens of summer moss creeping over stone. Always, the number 4 guided him. 4 steps to approach the sight, 4 distinct visual anchors in each composition, 4 moments in the viewer's experience. The first shock, the gradual recognition, the lingering fascination, and the final, inescapable unease. Even his weapon, crafted specifically to his taste, echoed this rhythm, forcing him to reload after 4 shots, a deliberate break in the performance that gave each act a defined beginning and end. In time, those who encountered his work began to recognize its signatures, the exact placement of a victim's hands, the use of light to create a halo or a shadow mask, the presence of objects, sometimes personal to the victim, sometimes entirely unrelated, that added a layer of mystery to the scene. These details became a language of their own, one that spoke more loudly than any words could. And so, the legend of the Golden Demon was not only revived, but refined. He was no longer merely a killer, whispered about in fearful tones. He had become something more elusive, more unsettling, an artist whose medium was mortality, whose whose gallery was the land itself, and whose audience was never quite sure whether they had seen the last of his work or the first of a new, more elaborate series. In the quiet hours between his performances, when no one was watching and the world seemed still, Jhin's mind was not at rest. It was a place of ceaseless calculation, a theater where possibilities played out in intricate patterns. He would walk through a marketplace or along the banks of a stream and see not the people or the water, but lines, angles of approach, points of symmetry, shadows that could be lengthened or shortened depending on the time of day. To most, the world was chaos. To Jhin, it was a puzzle waiting to be solved. He believed there was a hidden order beneath everything, a rhythm that could be uncovered with patience and precision. His obsession with the number 4 was not superstition, nor mere habit. It was his key to this rhythm. 4 was balance. 4 was completeness. A chair with 4 legs stands firm. A composition with 4 focal points draws the eye in harmony. Even in music, he found 4 beats could hold an entire piece together, no matter how complex the melody above it. When he planned the killing, it was never the act of ending a life that interested him. Death was simply the final brushstroke on the canvas. The true art was in the preparation, the choice of location, the arrangement of objects, the anticipation of how the scene would be discovered. He imagined the moment when someone would first step into his composition, the sharp intake of breath, the momentary confusion as their mind tried to make sense of what it saw. That moment, the collision of beauty and horror, was his masterpiece. He was not unaware of the fear he caused. In fact, fear was one of his chosen tools, but he did not use it crudely. For Jhin, fear was like light. It could be shaped, directed, softened, or sharpened. Sometimes it was immediate, the kind that made the heart race and the breath quicken. Other times it was slow, seeping into the mind like ink into paper, staining every thought until it could not be removed. Over time, certain motifs began to recur in his work. A single flower placed in a victim's hand, chosen not for its symbolism, but for the way its color contrasted with the surrounding scene. A spiral of stones leading the viewer's gaze toward the center of the composition. The use of mirrors or reflective surfaces to create depth or distortion, as though the viewer was being drawn into the scene themselves. These elements were not random. They were signatures, layers of meaning for those who knew how to look. In this way, Jhin's work became more than killing. It became communication. The audience might not understand the language, but they felt its weight. Some saw in his work a kind of madness, others a dark genius. But to Jhin, these distinctions were meaningless. There was only the work, and the work was all that mattered. The world around him changed with each performance. People altered their routines, avoiding certain roads or marketplaces. Towns began to post guards not at their gates, but at places where the light fell just so at certain hours. Places that, in Jhin's would have been perfect stages. The more they tried to predict him, the more he adapted, finding beauty in the unexpected, turning limitations into opportunities. Through it all, he remained untethered. He had no permanent home, no companions, no possessions beyond his tools and the clothes on his back. The land itself was his studio, and his people were, in his mind, both audience and material. He passed like a shadow through Ionian forests, through mountain passes where the air grew thin and sharp, through coastal villages where the waves whispered against the shore. And wherever he went, sooner or later, there would be a scene. To those who knew the truth of his release from Tula, he was an asset. Dangerous, yes, but useful. To those who only knew the whispers, he was a phantom, a reminder that death could be as deliberate and as inevitable as the turning of the seasons. And to Jhin himself, he was neither asset nor phantom. He was an artist, and art, true art, could never be contained. By the time years had passed since his release from Tula, Jhin's presence in Ionia was no longer measured by the number of his appearances, but by the shadow he cast over the land. His name, rarely spoken above a whisper, had taken root in the collective imagination. For some, it was a warning to children, a way to keep them from wandering too far after dark. For others, it was a symbol of the dangers that still lurked in a nation not yet fully healed from war. His performances were less frequent now, but each was more elaborate than the last. They were not clustered in one province or along one road. They appeared in scattered locations, separated by months or even years, as though part of a pattern too large for any one person to see. The infrequency gave each event more weight. When news of a new scene spread, it rippled across provinces, carried by travelers, merchants, and hushed conversations in tea houses. In many places, people claimed to have seen his work, even when they had not. A body arranged with unusual care, a strange symmetry in the placement of objects at the crime scene. Such things might be attributed to Jhin, whether or not he had been involved. This, in its own way, was part of his art. He had become not only an actor in the world, but a ghost in the minds of those who feared him, a hand they imagined in the shadows, even when he was far away. The Ionian authorities, fractured and inconsistent since the war, could do little more than clean up after him. They might erase the scenes, burn the cloths, dismantle the careful arrangements, but by then, the true audience had already seen them. And even if every physical trace was destroyed, the memory remained, passed from one pair of lips to another, each retelling preserving the image, if not the details. In this way, Jhin's work had taken on a second life. It lived not only in the physical arrangements he left behind, but in the stories told about them. Each retelling altered the shape slightly, added a flourish, or smoothed over a rough edge, much like a painter might revisit the canvas over time. The myths became part of the art, and Jhin, ever the perfectionist, did nothing to contradict them. There were times when he would return, quietly, to a place where he had once left the scene. Often, the original stage had changed, flowers grown over the site, structures rebuilt, or the land reclaimed by nature. Yet even here, traces remained, not in the objects, but in the way people moved through the space, in the hesitations of their footsteps, or the way they avoided certain corners without realizing why. These invisible ripples pleased him. They were the proof that his work had endured beyond its moment, that it had imprinted itself on the living world. And still, the number 4 governed him. 4 years might pass between visits to the same province. 4 distinct scenes might be left in a single year, each in a different quadrant of the map. To the casual observer, this was coincidence. To Jhin, it was a silent signature. In the end, Jhin was not chasing recognition in the traditional sense. Fame was fleeting, the applause of an audience was transient. What he sought was permanence, not in the survival of the body, but in the survival of the image. The body decayed, the objects weathered, the seasons turned. But the image, once placed in the mind, could live forever. And so he moved on, as he always had, passing unseen through the folds of Aeonian terrain. Somewhere ahead, a perfect stage awaited, the right light, the right space, the right balance of beauty and fragility. He would find it, as he always did. And when he did, his work would speak for itself, not in words, but in the language of form, color, and silence. In time, perhaps, the world would forget the man they called the Golden Demon, but it would never forget the moments he created, the stillness, the symmetry, the unbearable beauty of an ending captured in perfect balance. That was the legacy he sought, and the one he would leave, as inevitable and as precise as the fourth and final note of a song. Tula prison was not like the stone fortresses of Demacia, nor the sprawling dungeons of Noxus. It was quieter, more disciplined, built into the side of a weathered mountain, where the mists clung to the rock like a second skin. To outsiders, it might have seemed almost serene. Rows of worn steps carved into the slope, pale walls marked by the passage of countless seasons, and a silence broken only by the distant call of wind through the high passes. For Jhin, it was not serenity. It was a stage stripped bare. No audience, no props, no light, except the thin shaft of morning sun that entered his cell for only a few minutes each day. The world here was reduced to essentials. The texture of the stone beneath his fingers, the slow drip of water from a crack in the ceiling, the measured breathing of the guards outside his door. At first, the absence of color and form might have unsettled another man. For Jhin, it became an exercise in perception. With nothing to arrange, he began to compose scenes in his mind. The cracks in the wall became rivers. The shadows on the floor shifted with the day, creating shapes he memorized and reimagined. The limited space became an advantage. He could study the way dust settled in corners, the way light changed its tone as the sun moved unseen beyond the mountain. His meals came on a tray, the arrangement of which became another small puzzle. A bowl, a cup, a folded cloth. Sometimes he would move them before touching the food, just to create a symmetry that pleased him. Even in confinement, the rhythm of four never left him. 4 steps from one wall to the other. 4 breaths held in silence before exhaling. 4 slow blinks before closing his eyes to sleep. Time in Tula did not pass as it did outside. The days were not marked by events, but by repetitions. The same footsteps of the morning guard, the same rattle of keys, the same scrape of wood on stone when the meal was delivered. And yet, within these repetitions, Jhin found endless variations. A droplet of water falling at a slightly different angle, a change in the way a shadow stretched across the floor. He noticed everything. When the interrogators came, they expected resistance or fear. Instead, they found a man who spoke sparingly, whose eyes followed the lines of the room rather than the faces of his questioners. He gave them nothing they could use, and yet, in his stillness, there was a sense of calculation, as though he were studying them as much as they studied him. Years passed in this way, though Jhin did not count them. Time, to him, was a circle, not a line. Each day contained the seed of the next, and in the quiet space between, he refined his inner vision. He imagined the stages he would one day build again, the compositions he would arrange with living subjects and open air. Tula was not the end of his art. It was a long inhale before the next performance. When the day of his release finally came, it was without warning. The guards gave no explanation. They simply led him from his cell, down the worn steps, and out into the pale mountain light. The air outside was sharper than he remembered, scented with pine and distant rain. And as he descended into the world once more, he carried with him not the memory of imprisonment, but the discipline it had sharpened in him. The next act, he knew, would be his finest yet. Jhin had chosen it not for its people, but for the light. In this season, the sun sank low along the ridge to the west, and for precisely 12 minutes, its rays fell through the gap between two hills, illuminating the northern square in a perfect rectangle. He had measured the angle in his mind, traced the way it crept across the paving stones, and imagined the composition it could hold. On the appointed day, he arrived before the light did. The square was empty, save for the faint smell of fresh bread from a nearby oven and the quiet flutter of cloth on the laundry line. He moved with deliberate steps, placing each element as he had planned, not hurried, not hesitant, but as though following a score already written, a scattering of petals across the stone, their color chosen to echo the faint blush of the clouds above, a length of silk, pale and translucent, arranged so that the breeze would lift it gently at intervals, revealing and concealing in equal measure. The final element was the subject itself, positioned with care at the center of the frame. There was no violence in the arrangement now, only stillness, yet that stillness carried the unmistakable weight of finality. The hands were folded in a way that suggested repose. The head turned slightly, as though towards some distant sound. Around the figure, space was left open, so that the eye was drawn inward, unimpeded, to the heart of the composition. Then the light came. It touched first the edge of the square, a pale wash that deepened as it advanced. In moments, it found the silk, which blazed with a muted fire, and then the petals, each glowing as if lit from within. Finally, it reached the center, wrapping the subject in that perfect golden frame. For 12 minutes, the scene existed in its entirety. Every detail balanced, every angle exact, every shadow in its place. When the sun slipped lower, the light receded, taking the colors with it. The square returned to its ordinary state, the air cooling, the petals dimming to their natural hue. But in those who would later find it, the image would remain, burned not into the stones, but into memory, precise and unyielding. Jhin did not stay to watch them discover it. His part was done. The scene was complete the moment the light had touched it. The audience, whether they came minutes or hours later, were only witnesses to an echo. As he walked away, the rhythm of his steps matched the quiet pulse of his thoughts. 4 beats, always 4. The path from the village wound upward into the hills, where the grasses swayed in the evening wind, and the sky deepened into the soft blue of approaching night. Behind him, the valley held its secrets. Ahead, somewhere unseen, lay the next stage. There would be another perfect moment, another arrangement, another 12 minutes, where the world would align in balance before dissolving again into imperfection. For now, the land was calm, the air cool, and the last notes of the day fading into silence. And in that silence, Jhin moved onward, not as a man chased by the past, but as an artist, forever seeking the next perfect frame, the next composition where beauty and finality would meet in absolute harmony.